What if the person you'd cross the street to avoid is the only one who can save the thing you value most? I keep asking myself that whenever I replay what happened on Forge Avenue at 7:43 on a heat-shimmering Thursday, when a rare Nimbus Valkyr coughed blue-gray breath into the air like a wounded animal, and the crowd did what crowds do, pointed cameras and sharpened opinions. The car belonged to Adrian Cole, a wonderkind of the quantum tech world, the kind of man who can make a market move by clearing his throat. And the man he refused to look in the eye, at least at first, was Marcus Hale, who had slept the night before under a corrugated awning 2 blocks from the industrial canal, his backpack doubled as a pillow, his mind running thermodynamic equations the way other people hum songs from childhood. "Don't touch my car," Adrian said without looking up from his phone, the words so practiced they came out like muscle memory. I know that tone. It's the sound of power protecting itself. Smoke laced with coolant sweetness lifted from the Valkyr's side vents, and even from 10 paces I could see the rhythm was wrong. Marcus saw more. He'd been watching the Nimbus models glide past Tech Row for months, not with envy, but with a mechanic's ear. The Valkyr's tri-loop cooling system had a weak seam if the secondary channel flexed against the tertiary shield at high load and heat like this. He had flagged that exact stress line in a memo at Orion Aeroworks years ago when he consulted on a predecessor system, but deadlines and bonuses have a way of drowning out quiet caution. Now here it was, in the real world, in color and sound, singing its failure to anyone fluent enough to listen. "Sir," Marcus said, palms visible, voice steady as a metronome in a hurricane, "your quantum thrust cooling has a micro fracture in the secondary loop. It's venting into the tertiary chamber. I can fix it." Adrian's thumb hovered over speed dial. His security team from a neighboring campus was already idling in a black SUV. 2 men stepped out, hands clasped in front in that polite but prepared posture you learn in private training. It's uncomfortable to write this, but I need to be honest. Marcus's beard was overgrown, his shirt 2 launderings past its prime, and that alone was enough for half the crowd to decide he didn't belong this close to something worth $4.2 million. Bias is a kind of smoke too. It fills the lungs without the guilty noticing. "How would you know anything about this platform?" Adrian asked, finally letting his eyes flick over Marcus like a scanner trying to reject a counterfeit bill. "Because I helped design the prototype architecture the Valkyr borrows from," Marcus answered. And when Adrian laughed, sharp, almost theatrical, Marcus didn't flinch. "The smoke color tells you the nanocoolant is flashing off the thermal shield. You have at best 47 minutes before bearing damage becomes permanent." The number wasn't a guess. The Valkyr's diagnostics chimed right then, with a countdown within 2 minutes of Marcus's prediction, and you could feel the crowd lean in as if the city had shifted on its axis. "Mr. Cole," one guard murmured, "we should secure the area. IP exposure risk." The phrase landed like a gavel. Marcus didn't move. "Call up internal memo ORA 3447 from Orion," he said quietly. "The one your legal team redacted before licensing. That's my analysis." The memo code made Adrian's eyes narrow. It's not the kind of detail that drifts across gossip blogs, but doubt is a stubborn animal, especially when fed by fear of looking foolish. "ID?" the taller guard asked. Marcus handed over the only card he had, a shelter badge with a first name, a last name, and a barcode the city's scanner sometimes read and sometimes didn't. The guard stepped away to call, returned with that particular look, a mixture of pity and distance I've seen too many times. "No fixed address, gap in employment, volunteer notes at Northgate Harbor. That's all." "Thank you for trying," Adrian said, already half-turned, already closing the story in his head where the hero looks expensive and the lesson is safe. The Valkyr coughed again. The smoke deepened a note, and time kept eating. "Make one call," Marcus said, and if there was pride in it, I couldn't hear it. I heard math. "Dr. Priya Nayar at Ether Labs. Put me on speaker." There's a reason some names cut through the haze. Adrian knew Priya. He hit dial. His posture changed while he listened, and I wish I had a recording of the exact moment his skepticism cracked. You could teach a whole class on it. "Is that Marcus?" Priya's voice, precise and warm, filled the air. Adrian, if Marcus Hale tells you he can stabilize that loop, let him. We still cite his work in our spacecraft stack. There are maybe 3 people on this planet I'd trust with a field fix on that architecture. He's one. The guard who'd called the shelter shifted his weight, stood less like a wall and more like a person. Bias doesn't vanish. It melts slowly under heat. I owe you an apology, Adrian said after the call, but Marcus shook his head once. You owe your car a chance to make your next meeting, he replied. That line shouldn't be profound, but it kind of is. It took courage for Adrian to reach down and pop the hood release. It also took desperation. The countdown had slipped under 30 minutes, and the authorized service van was at least 2 hours out. I want to linger on one thing. In that sliver of time, 2 men who shouldn't have met, one insulated by wealth, one exposed to weather, agreed to share risk. That's the hinge of the whole story. Marcus inventoried the emergency kit like a surgeon working a field hospital. Sealant syringes, pressure clamps, a thermal blanket, a roll of aluminum tape. No graphite compound. I need 9B graphite sticks, industrial if they have them, art store otherwise, no, he said. The shorter guard jogged to the corner shop. There's a reason for the grade, Marcus added to no one in particular. Particle structure blends with the polymer base at the temperature window we have. I'm telling you, it felt like watching someone write a theorem while a metronome counted down behind his ear. When the guard returned with pencils, Marcus cracked them open with a controlled impatience, shaved the cores, blended dust with sealant until the mix took on a faint metallic sheen. And I swear to you, the noise of the street softened around those motions, like the city itself wanted to hear the outcome. I need light, he said. 3 phones rose without being asked. If you were there, you felt your own assumptions wobble as calibration met circumstance. Adrian held his breath. The crowd actually stopped filming for a beat. Even I, who believes in underdogs as a rule, felt the old, unkind question try to crawl into my mouth. What if this fails and just proves the stereotype everyone here came to confirm? That's the ugliest part of bias, the way it recruits even the sympathetic. Marcus didn't seem to carry that weight. He carried a torque driver, loosened an access panel the manufacturer pretends doesn't exist, and exposed a line so thin it would be invisible to anyone without a map in their head. Vapor whispered from the microcrack. Right where it always wanted to be, he murmured, almost tenderly. Not because he loved the flaw, but because he respected the physics. That distinction matters. He wicked off the contaminated nano-coolant into a makeshift catch from the kit's clamshell, saved what he could, vented the rest, and buttered the fracture with the graphite-rich sealant. Building layers the way you build trust, with care and pressure in the right measure. This will hold, he said, if you don't ask for heroics. Keep output under 70% until you can swap the channel with a proper part. You'll be fine. The countdown flashed 9 minutes, then 8. Then the warning tone changed color because the system finally recognized a new boundary condition. That's the moment I felt something unclench in my chest. I've seen men like Adrian live entire lives without needing anyone they didn't pre-approve. Dependence can be humiliating or holy. Which one it is depends on what you do next. When Adrian pressed the start, the Valkyr sang the way it was designed to sing, high, crystalline, then settling into a low, predatory purr. And you could hear 50 strangers exhale at once. The diagnostic readout scrolled from hostile red to stabilized amber, cooling functional, capacity limited, service recommended. The crowd wasn't cheering for a car, they were cheering for a correction inside themselves. I know that sounds grand, but I was there, and you don't forget the sound of people relearning how to see. Adrian stared at the screen as if it had confessed to something he didn't think machines could feel. Gratitude, maybe. Then he did an ordinary thing that felt like an extraordinary one. He offered his hand. Thank you, he said, and this time he looked at the man he was thanking. Marcus took his hand with the same precision he'd applied to the repair. You're welcome, he said, nothing more. If the story ended there, we could all go home smug and satisfied. But Adrian is a builder by DNA, and curiosity pulled on him harder than status could warn him off. Come with me, he said to Marcus, glancing at a watch that could choose a board meeting's mood by its shine. I have an investor pitch in 90 minutes. We're unveiling a thermal regulation system for quantum compute. If you can improvise a fix like that on a sidewalk, I want your eyes on our deck. Marcus looked down at himself, at the sleeves frayed by weather, at the boots that had walked too many miles looking for a door that would open. I'm not dressed to be the one in the room you introduced, he said, and it wasn't false modesty, it was physics of another kind. Adrian considered, made a call with the same decisive cadence he'd used to acquire companies. Argent Taylors, he said into the phone. 30 minutes. We need measurements, a charcoal suit, white shirt, soft shoulder jacket. Yes, now power, when it repents, can be very efficient. There's a temptation to romanticize the transformation that followed, a wash basin, a barber's quiet competence, the alchemy of good cloth. But that would be dishonest. Clothes do not erase 3 years of sleeping light and living by your wits. What they can do, for better and worse, is let certain doors open without a fight. In the mirror at Argent, Marcus looked like the version of himself people had once paid plane tickets to hear, and I caught a flicker of something between sadness and anger in his eyes. Appearances are part of the machine, he said softly. I can hate that and still use it like a lever. That line has been rattling around my head ever since. The guard who'd run for pencils, his name was Jace, I learned, hovered by the door, wanting to say something but not sure which words wouldn't be patronizing. In the end, he said the only ones that mattered. I misjudged you, Jace offered. I'm sorry. Marcus didn't make it easy or dramatic. Thank you, he replied. And then he nodded once, the way men do when they're busy choosing what to carry forward and what to put down. The SUV ride to Cole Vector's glass and steel campus cut across neighborhoods Marcus usually crossed at ground level. I want to admit something here as a narrator. I felt my throat tighten when he watched the city slide past from leather seats he hadn't expected to touch again. This is where commentary matters, because without it we risk turning a life into a plot device. The drop from renowned engineer to the edges of shelter life didn't happen because Marcus forgot calculus. It happened because accusation sticks faster than exoneration, because an HR database with a red flag can close more doors than a reference letter can open, because once you lose an address, you become invisible to systems that require you to already be visible to get basic help. When Adrian asked for the short version, what happened after Orion, Marcus told it without adjectives, the way you tell a weather report you had to endure. A prototype rushed for a launch window. Safety protocols overridden. A failure that cost money it was easier to blame on the team than on the timeline. Rumors about temperament, the old whisper that black excellence must hide a flaw to make the spreadsheet feel tidy. A year of interviews that turned into tests of patience and dignity. Then a day when his lease ran out the same week the last of his savings went to help a friend from the shelter who was sicker and older than he was. After that, everything got harder and smaller at once. Why didn't you call Priya? Adrian asked, maybe thinking of the way he can text CEOS and have them call back from planes. Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. A number in your phone is not the same as permission to interrupt a world that's moved on, he said. And pride is a molecule that dissolves slowly. I keep replaying that. Sometimes the thing that keeps us alive in the climb becomes the weight that drags us when we fall. He didn't cloak it in inspiration. He just stated the condition like an engineer reading a gauge. Cole Vector's lobby is the kind of place designed to make capital feel welcome. Stone that gleams without shouting. Art that implies a futurism you can brag about at dinner. People stared. Of course they did. Some recognized Adrian's guest. The CTO, Sophia Reyes, recognized him instantly. Not possible, she whispered, then amended herself as she approached. No, actually, it tracks. Marcus Hale, we've argued footnotes with your patents for 5 years. It wasn't flattery. It was professional relief disguised as admiration. Adrian introduced them, added the sidewalk repair like a flourish at the end of a magic trick, and Sophia laughed the cracked open laugh of a scientist who's just watched elegance trump bureaucracy. Graphite infusion into polymer sealant at that temperature is exactly the sort of simple as brilliant fix we talk ourselves out of, she said. Come break our design gently. The investors were already arranging their bottled waters, and folding their arms the way smart money does when it wants to look like a jury. Adrian didn't hide Marcus in the back. He sat him near the front, and then he did something that matters more than the catering or the deck or the valuation. He told the room the truth. The unfixable problem everyone keeps calling unfixable was fixed this morning by a man our systems have not treated fairly, he said. I am learning from that, in public. That line will read like PR to some, but in the room it felt like a shift of gravity. Maybe you had to hear the way the last word landed. Less performance, more confession. I won't summarize the entire pitch. That comes next. But I want to freeze one more small moment because it taught me something I don't want to forget. Jace the guard stood in the back with Kellen Briggs, the head of campus security who had been ready to pull Marcus off the Valkyr by the elbow. Kellen kept his face professional, but he watched Marcus the way you watch a live feed when the stakes are high. When the first slide flickered and the buzz settled into attention, Kellen leaned toward Jace just enough for me to catch half a sentence. Right call, bringing the pencils, he said. Jace shrugged, embarrassed. He told me the brand, he whispered back. That's the thing about trust. Sometimes it starts as obedience and becomes respect only in hindsight. Adrian's deck was good, as these things go. Tight story arc, credible benchmarks, the right mix of fear and greed. Cole Vector's new thermal regulation lattice for quantum processing promised stability at higher qubit density without the hysteresis that eats data alive in the transients. It was the kind of pitch that usually earns a term sheet on pedigree alone. But when the room turned to Marcus for comment, the air changed. He didn't clear his throat or perform humility. He did what he's built to do. He taught. Two things you're underestimating and one thing you're overbuilding, he began, and nobody fidgeted. The first underestimation was a micro-vibration coupling between the cooling lattice and the chassis at certain frequencies. An effect invisible in lab benches, but alive in racks where air handling introduces harmonics. Marcus sketched a serpentine decoupler on a legal pad and handed it to Sophia, proposing a composite with asymmetrical damping layers that would cut the resonance spike by a third. The second was a transient bubble formation in the nano-coolant under abrupt load changes, a phenomenon the model smoothed over because it was trained on steady-state data. Your simulation assumes patience the real world won't grant you, he said softly, and then he outlined a pressure relief microchannel that only opens under a narrow temperature pressure window, preserving efficiency while shaving off the dangerous peaks. The overbuild was my favorite because it revealed his ethic. He pointed to a redundant monitoring array that cost money for reassurance rather than for utility. You don't need 3 eyes to see a color, he said. You need one eye that perceives truthfully. He proposed a single sensor with a smarter algorithm, freed budget, and fewer failure points. The estimated efficiency gain after his edits? 34% on paper, but the kind of paper that becomes a prototype faster than you think when the right people are in the room. Investors ask questions for sport. That day they asked to learn. Marcus answered without jargon that excludes or hand-waving that deceives. The man who had mixed pencil graphite into emergency sealant an hour earlier now mixed humility into authority and made it look obvious. When the last question died and the clock on the wall felt sheepish for having marched forward, every fund in the room increased their commitment. If you're allergic to happy endings, I get it. So am I. But this wasn't a miracle. It was a correction. The capital didn't fall from the sky. It followed competence the way heat follows a gradient. After the room cleared, handshakes, quick photos, promises to circle back that for once were not euphemisms. Adrian closed the glass door and sat across from Marcus, with a look I've seen on founders who just realized they'd been too small in their imagining. Name your terms, he said, and he meant salary, title, team, all the toys we pretend are the point. Marcus didn't lean forward like a man smelling redemption. He leaned back like a man considering a map. I'll be direct, he said. It's not enough to bring me inside the castle. I want to rebuild the bridge over the moat. He reached into his jacket. Funny how quickly a jacket becomes part of your gestures, and unfolded pages that look like they'd lived in a notebook beside a sleeping bag. Diagrams, equations, notes in a blocky hand, tuned by years of whiteboards and then 3 years of recycled margins. One design was a cooling architecture for quantum neural networks I don't have the vocabulary to do justice to. Another was a passive safety failover that, if I heard correctly, could reduce catastrophic thermal events by an order of magnitude at scale. These were drawn on library tables at 9 a.m. when the doors opened, Marcus said. I've been busy while being invisible. He didn't say it to win sympathy. He said it to establish the premise for what came next. There are people at Northgate Harbor and shelters like it who used to lecture and build and write code. Some lost addresses, some lost spouses, some lost to biases subtle enough to be deniable and brutal enough to be effective. I want to build a lab that finds them, funds them, feeds them, gives them the dignity of keycards and deadlines. An institute for overlooked brilliance. The open bench. He let the name hang there, not as marketing, but as promise. Adrian didn't blink as much as he let his blink last longer. You want me to bankroll a skunkworks with a conscience, he said. I want you to partner in building a pipeline that shame can't clog, Marcus replied. You'll get patents that justify any spreadsheet you bring to your board. I'll get a chance to make the last 3 years mean something beyond my own story. Sophia had been quiet at the window. She turned then, the CTO mask set aside so the engineer could speak. We can allocate a wing and wrap it in a non-profit arm, she said. Governance that keeps the talent safe from the whims of a quarter. If we're serious, that last clause sat down in the center of the room and refused to move until someone touched it. Here's where I add my own view, not because you need my opinion to enjoy the arc, but because stories without stakes become sugar. I think the world keeps losing time because we insist that genius must arrive dressed as we expect. We spend fortunes designing filters that feel like fairness, but function like fences. Watching Adrian consider the open bench, I realized how rare it is for a man with leverage to choose to shorten someone else's distance to the table instead of just extending his own. We'll do it, he said, and the way he said it made me believe he would survive the memos and the lawyers and the long meetings where good ideas go to be sanded down. Not as charity, he added, as strategy. Marcus nodded. Strategy is what you call justice when you finally understand its ROI, he said, and that's going on my wall. Before the day ended, 3 things happened I don't want to lose in the summary. First, Adrian wired a fee to Northgate Harbor in Marcus's name, not hush money or optics, but back rent on the idea that people who save your day deserve more than thanks. Second, Kellen Briggs came to Marcus alone, without the armor of a team, and apologized for the near ejection on Forge Avenue. I saw a profile, not a person, he said. I'll fix that loop in my own head. Third, Priya Nayar texted a photo of an old whiteboard from a conference 5 years ago. Marcus's equations circled, her handwriting scrawled beside them. Listen to this man. It had taken time. Too much of it, but the listening had begun again. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever misjudged a stranger who turned out to be the one you needed. I'm not asking to farm engagement. I'm asking because I think our comment threads can become small laboratories where we test better reflexes. Next, we're going to follow Marcus and Adrian as the open bench moves from paper to noisy, beautiful reality. And we'll see what happens when an industry that forgot a man has to look him in the eye while he hires the people it taught itself to ignore. If you want that chapter, you know what to do. Here's where people usually cut to a triumphant montage. Fast clips of a signed term sheet, a ribbon cutting, a handshake made iconic by the right filter. Real life isn't a montage. It's meetings you didn't plan for, and decisions that look small until you realize they change the angle of the whole road. The morning after the investor pitch, the open bench existed only as a name Marcus had written in block letters on a coffee-stained page. By nightfall, it had a temporary wing on the 3rd floor of Cole Vector's South Building, a line item in a budget Sophia fought for like a litigator, and a mandate that was both modest and impossible. Find overlooked brilliance and give it oxygen. Adrian could deploy capital fast. Money is just another kind of coolant, if you think about it. But capital doesn't unlearn habits. The company's own systems had to be retuned, so the same filters that once would have bounced Marcus at the lobby didn't quietly bounce the next him in a resume queue. HR wanted interview rubrics. Legal wanted indemnification. Security wanted to know precisely who would be allowed into a room that housed a prototype worth more than a penthouse. Marcus listened, patient the way you get when you've been forced to practice patience long enough that it becomes a muscle. And then he did what he'd done with the Valkyr. He drew a practical loop where everyone else saw an abstract problem. He wrote 3 rules on a whiteboard and underlined them once. No gatekeeping by proxies. Pay for people's time from day one. Measure output, not optics. I'm telling you, that moment mattered. It made administrators inhale as if they'd been caught slouching. And it made the people the open bench was built for feel like the door wasn't ornamental. The first cohort arrived one Tuesday that smelled like printer toner and late coffee. A machinist named Lila with forearms like braided cable and hands steady enough to stitch a hairline weld. A software architect, Jorge, who had been sleeping in his car while pushing commits to an open-source project that 3 Fortune 500s were using without knowing his handle belonged to a man brushing his teeth in a gas station sink. A medical researcher, Dr. Annika Bose, who could build a microfluidic array from a drawer of parts in a soup spoon. A kid named Uzi who didn't have a degree but had built a low-noise power supply from salvage that made a doctoral student swear out loud. They didn't look like a brochure. They looked like a problem set the world had missolved. Marcus gave them real work, not errands meant to build confidence, actual problems with actual stakes. Damp resonance in a test rig, jitter in a sensor's PLL, the thermal hysteresis blip he had flagged in Adrian's deck. I watched a kind of electricity you can't measure take hold, a dignity current, if there is such a thing, when people realized nobody in that glass room expected them to be grateful just for being allowed to stand there. Not everyone loved it. Change never walks alone. It brings cousins named slander and doubt. The comments under the viral clip of the sidewalk repair started clean and got muddy in the way online water does. Staged, someone wrote with the certainty of a man who trusts his cynicism more than his eyes. A blogger with a smooth podcast voice and a talent for sculpting innuendo suggested the open bench was PR cosplay to distract from layoffs in another division. A rival executive sniffed to a reporter that real innovation never needs theatrics. Reynolds, the security chief from the tech campus, who had almost ordered Marcus off the Valkyr, requested a formal meeting. He arrived with a folder of concerns and a face that looked like he'd practiced it in a mirror until it didn't show what he actually felt. He talked about intellectual property leaks and attack surfaces and headlines that start with ex-employee allegedly. He wasn't wrong on the risk. Villains read too. Sophia didn't flinch. Risk is not a veto, she said, and you could hear the engineer in her outrank the executive. It's a thing we manage with design. She and Marcus rewrote access protocols between lunch and 3 p.m. Not to add more locks, but to add better logging, the kind that makes accountability a physics rather than a punishment. Reynolds, to his credit, read the draft, then set his folder down like a man who'd been invited to contribute, instead of told to patrol. I can work with this, he said. That sentence is an unsung hero in every progress story. The first technical proof that the open bench wasn't charity arrived on a Wednesday when the building's HVAC made that old familiar hum that turns smooth data ragged at the edges. Lila had been watching accelerometer traces the way a cardiologist reads a monitor. She pointed to a bump nobody else had noticed, a coupling frequency that rode the ductwork like a stowaway. Your platform's picking up the building's heartbeat, she said, and then she sketched a bracket with an asymmetric mass that would shift the mode shape out of trouble. It was ugly the way solutions are when they care about function more than applause. It worked. The test rack's noise floor dropped. The sweet spot widened. The graphs looked like Victory's thumbnail. Adrian walked into the lab with a grin that could power a hallway and tried to hide the way it turned into something like gratitude. Name it, he said jokingly, because men who build things love naming rights. But Lila just shrugged. I've been trying to name myself again first. I made a note of that in my head where I keep lines I want to repeat to future me. Then, because every story needs a conflict that isn't just atmospheric, Tech Horizon's VP of Legal sent a letter, thick paper, lawyer font, alleging that a side-angle photo from the sidewalk incident showed proprietary internals of the Valkyr, and requesting, in that tone that says request like a threat, says please, that the open bench preserve all records pending possible action. Cynics will tell you this is how the world always behaves when you embarrass it with evidence. Maybe they're right. Marcus read the letter once without changing expression, then again like an engineer reading a spec. They think shame is a gasket, he said. They think if they tighten the bolts, it will stop the leak. Adrian wanted to answer with a press conference and a counter letter. Sophia wanted to answer by shipping so much progress that the letter read like an antique in a week. Marcus chose the third thing. He asked Jace, the guard with the pencils, to bring the cohort to Northgate Harbor that night with a shopping list. Whiteboards, pizza, a second-hand projector, bus passes for anyone who needed a ride. We'll recruit in public, he said. They can serve papers to a room full of people who got there early and stayed late. I wish I could hand you the smell of that room. Dry erase, cheese, and hope. People came who hadn't been invited to anything worth dressing for in a long time. They touched prototypes like they were shaking hands with their future. And no, Tech Horizon didn't sue. Maybe they realized litigation would make the clip grow another head. Maybe Reynolds made a call. Maybe the world just chose the more interesting story. Adrian learned something he couldn't have bought: how to be led by someone who had no leverage except truth. He started asking a new question in meetings, the kind of question that makes a room sit up because it runs on a current you can't fake. Who's not here who would make this better? It sounds simple until you try to answer it, without resorting to the usual names your circle always supplies. People rolled their eyes at first, then they started bringing chairs. It didn't fix everything. A manager in a different group still tried to bury a candidate with the old culture fit euphemism until Marcus raised his eyebrow high enough that the man heard himself. A procurement workflow still tried to trap a vendor from the shelter in net 90 purgatory until Sophia signed an exemption that let them eat and build in the same month. But the slope of the graph changed. You could feel it in the way reception learned regulars' names, and in the way a daytime custodian asked if she could take the lunch and learn on signal integrity, and nobody laughed. I've got to confess my own bias here, because commentary without confession is just posture. I went to the shelter event expecting to take notes for a story that would make me feel good about the species for a weekend. I left with a list of people whose hands I wanted to get out of my pockets. That's what the open bench did. It snuck into your day and edited your reflexes while you watched. Meanwhile, the tech that had made the investors lean in became something sharper. The serpentine decoupler wasn't just a sketch anymore. It lived in a test rack that responded to stress like a violin tuned by a patient ear. Jorge's rewrite of the sensor algorithm made the lab's emulation run without the burps that used to send interns for more coffee. Dr. Bose's microfluidic rig found a way to bleed heat off a hotspot with a capillary array so clever even the whiteboard looked smug. And Uzi, too young for the cynicism that tells you not to try, built a quiet little supply that shaved dB off a measurement that had been stubborn for a fiscal year. Incremental miracles, all of them, the kind that make the word engineering feel holy again. Then came a visit from Priya. She walked into the lab with a smile that had survived long nights in budget hearings, and the kind of fights you have with yourself when the meeting runs longer than your conviction. She hugged Marcus the way you hug a comrade who made it out of a lost position with the map intact. "You look like yourself," she said, and the room exhaled like they'd been waiting for her verdict. She wasn't there for nostalgia. Ether Labs was hitting the same thermal wall in a quantum neural network stack that Marcus had sketched on that coffee-stained page. "We've got 5 months of runway on this bet before the board starts asking about Plan B," she said, and then she set the plan on a bench like an offering. "I'd rather ask you." Marcus didn't beam or brag. He pointed to a corner where a prototype lived under a thermal blanket like a patient. "We're already drawing the road," he said. That night, after the lab had emptied and the building's heartbeat went back to its old rhythm, Marcus stayed, working in that level of focus you could use to slice bread. I stood at the window and watched a city that had once ignored him look small compared to a whiteboard where a new loop closed cleanly for the first time. You don't get many chances to be in the room when an equation becomes a working thing. We always ask people to subscribe and comment. This is a channel, after all. But if you were there with me, you wouldn't need the prompt. You'd want to tell someone what it felt like to watch justice sneak into a lab disguised as efficiency. Where are you watching from? Tell me. I want to know if your city hums at the same frequency and if, like me, you can feel the noise thinning. Reveals are a ritual. You cordon off a space, you hang lights, you circulate canapes on trays that make people feel wealthy, even if they came in on a bus. The open bench insisted on doing it in the courtyard between the South Building and the Annex, where the sun drops behind the steel like a curtain that knows its cues. Not everyone in the crowd wore a badge. Some wore the day's work, some wore a jacket bought with the first invoice paid on time in years. Jason Kellen stood shoulder to shoulder near a pillar, not guarding, but keeping time. Lila's mother sat in the front row, wiping her eyes as if she were checking the quality of the day's light. A kid from Northgate Harbor, the one who had watched Marcus at the shelter like a man looks at a bridge, held a hand-lettered sign that said thank you, even though nobody had asked for signs. PR would have preferred backdrops with logos. Marcus had compromised by letting them put a small banner on a table, the size of a courteous apology. When Adrian stepped up to the mic, he didn't do the founder swagger. He did something riskier. He told the story plain. A car that wasn't supposed to be fixable. A stranger who was supposed to be move-alongable. A call to a friend who told him he was in the presence of someone he didn't deserve to doubt. He let the part where he almost chose fear over curiosity sit in the air long enough to make the lesson visible. Then he gestured toward the lab doors. And then he taught me something I hadn't learned at scale, Adrian said. And I like that he added at scale because it's a confession and a plan at once. What you're about to see is a machine that runs cooler than its model says it should. Built by people your model says you should overlook. The prototype was inelegant in the way honest first things are. You could see the clamps and the tape that would get engineered out later. You could also see numbers on a display that made the kind of people who live on spreadsheets recalibrate their faces in real time. The decoupler stood like a small sculpture bolted to the frame. The microfluidic veins glimmered like frost under the thermal camera. The sensor readouts scrolled without the hiccup that used to make everyone cough and pretend they hadn't heard it. Priya asked for permission with a glance that only engineers read. Marcus nodded, and she touched a control and watched a peak fail to show up where failure had once been inevitable. That's not luck, she said to nobody and everybody. That's craft. Then something I didn't expect happened. Reynolds, the man who had arrived in this story wearing a suit that looked like a yes with conditions, raised his hand for the mic and waited like a schoolboy until Marcus tilted it toward him. He didn't clear his throat into it or try to frame himself as an ally in the way people do when they want forgiveness on a discount. He told a short, true story about a morning when he saw a profile instead of a person, and how, since then, he'd started asking his team to write their incident reports in a new way. We don't write transient mail anymore, he said, and the crowd shifted because they recognized the phrase. We write man in a blue jacket with a pencil and a plan. It sounds small, but it's where change begins for us. He handed the mic back like a man puts a tool down after he's learned how to use it. Adrian announced a revenue-sharing structure that would make the open bench its own engine instead of a cost center. Patents generated by the lab would belong to a trust controlled by a board that included members from Northgate Harbor and 2 other shelters, with licensing fees, funding stipends, housing vouchers, childcare slots, and a legal clinic for people clearing the bureaucratic gravel from their shoes. If you felt the room bristle when he used the word patents, I did too. We've learned to flinch when property enters the conversation about people who have had too much taken. But the trust architecture was math done with care. It bent the curve away from exploitation. Sophia explained it cleanly enough that I think even my cynical uncle would have nodded. You don't fix a leaky loop by telling it to be less leaky, she said. You change the pressure and the path. When the clapping stopped, Marcus didn't declare victory or pretend the road ahead would be lit like a film set. He did what he always does. He told the truth and then set a task. We did a public thing today, he said, and public things can fool you into believing they're the point. Tomorrow morning at 9, the work is the point again. If you're in this courtyard because you're curious, good. If you're here because you've got hands and a head and you've been waiting to be invited, better. The door is there. It's not glass you can see through but can't open. It's a door. He pointed at the lab as if it were a horizon. And to the people still writing letters to threaten us into stopping, come watch what happens when we don't. I need to put something here that isn't about optics or prototypes or corporate architecture because a story that lives in glass rooms isn't the story you tuned in for. After the crowd thinned and the sun decided to go be beautiful somewhere else, Marcus walked to Northgate Harbor alone, without an entourage, because walking had never become beneath him, even when a car was plausible. He sat on the curb outside the shelter with a man named Curtis who had taught him how to roll a blanket tight enough that it kept out 2 degrees of weather. They split a paper cup of coffee and talked about the day in the way soldiers talk about battles. Plain, careful not to lie with adjectives. I got my name back a little, Marcus said. Curtis nodded. Keep it, he replied. And then he grinned because he knew names belonged to communities as much as to people. Marcus handed him a key card to a small apartment Colvector had leased for the cohort. You'll lose less sleep with a door, he said. Curtis looked at the plastic like it might bite him, then put it in his shirt pocket with the tenderness of a man putting hope somewhere his hands won't break it. If you crave personal redemption as an ending, I can give you images. Marcus standing in a kitchen that isn't temporary, learning where the drawer for forks is, laughing when he opens 3 wrong ones before he finds it. Jace helping Usi fill out a W-9 with a hand that doesn't shake. Lila sending her mother a photo of a badge with her name spelled correctly for the first time in years. Priya and Sophia arguing good-naturedly over a variable name at a whiteboard, while a room full of people who weren't invited to those arguments last year lean in because it's their argument now too. But those are just bright pixels. The real picture is something quieter and more durable. An institution that learned humility and wrote it down in its procedures. An industry that got a little less lazy about who gets to be called a genius. A city that tuned its ear so the hum that used to mask everything started harmonizing instead. I promised you from the start that this wasn't a miracle story. Miracles absolve us too cheaply. This is a maintenance story. We learned to maintain a machine at higher density without failure? Yes. But more importantly, we learned to maintain a community at higher empathy without performative strain. There's a sentence I keep replaying because it carries the chapter title you can't see. Strategy is what you call justice when you finally understand its ROI. Adrian learned that from the man he almost called security on. I learned that from watching them choose the harder version of winning. Where are you listening from today? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if there's a Northgate Harbor by a different name where you are, and whether you know someone who needs a door more than they need your doubt. If this story found you at the right time, leave a tool below so the next person who scrolls past knows it isn't just content, it's a call. Subscribe if you want to follow the open bench as it makes its first 5 hires from the long resume pile the world forgot to read. We'll check back in when the first royalty check clears and the first lease gets signed and the first old lie about who belongs in the lab dies with a whimper because nobody's feeding it anymore. And if you're here because you needed permission to say, I can fix it about something other people tell you is broken beyond saving, this is me handing you a pencil. Mix your own graphite, find the crack, seal it, then teach the rest of us what we couldn't learn until you showed up.